I'm going to review the last 8 weeks, a broad overview of the things that you've done, and I'm going to compare it to some of the answers that you're providing and the ways that you're trying to make sense of the legal system. And remember, we want to remember that we're not talking about the ideals if we lived in a perfect world. We're talking about how the legal system functions in the world we actually live in. So I want to refer back to the grading scheme from the syllabus, and you'll remember that your grade is going to be determined by a self-grade with my review. And so the purpose here is that if you want to get an A, you need to be speaking about law and showing me you understand law as malleable, showing me that power is exercised, showing me you understand the legality narratives, showing me that you understand the difference between the ideal and how life really is, showing me that you understand the relationship between the criminal justice and legal systems, what the goal is, what inputs are, outputs, and that you're able to use the course materials in order to support these positions. So you're explaining why you believe these things and how you are starting to use them in the way that you're speaking, in the way that you're understanding the concepts. And that's going to be different than how you came into this class, and it's going to be able to show me that you're seeing beyond your own individual point of view. So those of you who are still struggling with this, which I think everyone really is, at this point, you're only 8 weeks in, you've still got some time to try to practice this. You're just starting to work it out. You're getting there, some of you, because you've been working out for a few weeks. But these are the questions you want to be asking yourself. Are you still referring to law as an ideal, right? If you are, that's a D, right? You haven't really learned from the readings and from the conversations we've had in this class about why that's not realistic. Are you still thinking that justice is automatic, that it's a set of consequences after you do something naughty, right? If you're still doing that, again, you're not really understanding the concepts from this class. Can you only see before the law? I think that's most of you are still struggling with this. And before the law really is this needs revision category. It's seeing the law as something mystical, as not really based in reality. Are you still referring to myths and overgeneralization? Are you recognizing your own bias and your own standpoint? These are the things that you want to be doing over the next month. So in quiz 2, you were being kind of tested to see how well you understood the legality narratives. Are you understanding what's called the monopoly of violence? Are you understanding the role of the judge as an executioner within that system of violence? Are you understanding the social construction of this role? Understanding that it's not natural, it doesn't just happen, is that people actually create this? And then are you understanding popular justice as a rebellion to this system, which is unequal in power? So the answer is no, right? Some of you are. The creation of the idea executioner as a social role, right? That's what creates this whole game. That's what creates this system. And that's an example that we're borrowing from the film and short story The Lottery to help you understand the legal system as a whole. The rest of you are still looking at this idea of picking up a stone. I want you to think about your bias and your unexamined assumptions there. You can't be possibly telling me that just if I go outside and I pick up a stone that I've committed a violent act. So I want you to really think hard about why you picked that answer and what you think that means and how much you're focusing on individual attributes, right? The mentality of people, their motive, these things that really aren't a part of the legal system, but they are part of popular television and psychology. And so I'm trying to get you now to think, again, like a legal scholar, and not based on what you've seen in TV. The next issues kind of had to do with the legality narratives, right? So the legality resists the law, for those of you who got the right answer, right? You understand that it's because the law is not objective or fair, right? It's not an example of before the law. It's not an ideal. It's based here in unequal power relationships. And it's unable to act on behalf of those who experience injustice, right? It doesn't just automatically happen. People have to try to use the legal system, and if it's unfair, they're not always going to get justice, and that it targets vulnerable people, and that's because of society targets vulnerable people. Now, some of you understand that through stereotypes, and sure, that's one manifestation of systemic racism and inequality, but that's not the only place that this happens. This also happens in our formal systems of law, politics, business, right? These all are carried out in the same way. The other thing is a lot of you are seeing these as separate. I understand why you believe that, right? It's because you had one idea. You were believing in before the law, many of you. Some of you already had a sense of resist the law, up against the law. Many of you are struggling with the concept of with the law. And so you're seeing these as distinct and separate because you only had one in your head. Now you're having to learn three. So to put it kind of strange speaking, you have to have three in your head. And so now you have to start to understand that these are interrelated. They all exist together. There's not one, that appears at one time and the other one appears at a different time. They're always existing all the time. The other thing is that with the law is something that's typically used among lawyers and business people because they have experience with the legal system. So they would never see it as before the law. They know it's not automatic. They know it's not ideal. They know they have to play the game, right? Same thing, resist the law. They might start to see it that way up against the law if it's not giving them the results that they want and they feel like they're playing the game correctly and they think they're playing it better than their opponent. They might shift over to that point of view. And then above the law was there to just kind of see if you were able to consider a fourth position, and that would be, kind of a very particular idea that you came up with in class. So I just wanted to see how that was working itself out. As you'll see, right, that you're still seeing these as separate, most of you, and so we want to try to help you in the next few weeks to start to see how these operate at the same time. But again, you have to work past your own standpoint. You have to start operating under the idea that just in the classroom, right, people have different conceptions and experiences with the legal system, and so now you have to acknowledge that they exist at the same time that you do, and so that means there's multiple ideas in the same room as you. So how much truer would that be out in the larger community, right, out in New York City generally? There's more and more and more people. That means they have more and more different experiences. So these narratives are all tied together. They're all based on each other, and we're all kind of bumping up against each other. Now this is another reading you really struggled with. Again, I think it's because it's really attacking a lot of the mythology that you believed in. It's going up against some of the things that you want to believe are true, but here's the evidence showing you it's not true. And this is a very respected scholar in the field, and so, for those of you who want to keep studying the legal system, these are the things you need to learn. If you're basing most of your ideas off of television, then you're not going to really learn any of these things, right? And so this is clashing. These two ideas are coming together. What do lawyers and legal scholars know versus what's presented to you in elementary school and popular television? And so, again, I used the example of the lottery to help you see that the same pattern, right? And also help you identify some of your own biases. So this is the troubling one, is that so many of you got this question wrong right from the very beginning, is that if you were to keep holding on to the before the law narrative and that it's automatic and it's right and moral, then you'd have to view the rebellion in the Declaration of Independence as illegal, right? And it was a violent act. And so that is going up against what you were kind of taught as kids and what we kind of portray the heroes of the founders, right? But you have to understand that it was illegal, right? From a legal point of view, from the British, from the English system, and they were violating the law. So they obviously, from their legality narrative, would have been up against the law. They felt like they weren't getting justice from that legal system, and so they had to revolt and form popular justice in order to create a new structure they thought would be better for them. That's not good or bad, right? We're not engaging in the morality of people's actions or their motives. What we're doing is saying this is what happened. This is a literal description of what happened, right? So these two narratives were clashing here. And so for you to show me that you still don't understand this, it really hints to me that you're still trying to hold on to the idea that law is automatic, that it's moral, that it's out there somewhere, that it's not really based on real experience. So a law that has nothing to do with humans, in other words. So this also kind of came out in not understanding that it's the creation of the executioner within the legal system. That's what creates the monopoly of violence. If you didn't have that creation of that system, then judges, frankly, wouldn't really exist, right? What would their role really be if they didn't have violence backing them up, right? In other words, they get people to obey the law because there's these men with guns that will come and lock you up if you don't obey the law, right? So that's where the before the law comes in. You got to get rid of the myth from before the law and start replacing that with violence. That's what holds this order together that you're craving. The lack of that order is not chaos. It's just a different order. Different people would be in charge, and they may or may not use violence, right? They might restore the exact same system, but with different people in it. And so, again, this isn't about being good or bad. This is just understanding that it's the creation. We created this. Executioners don't just exist in the world under a rock, right? We created these rules, and so this is a social agreement that people have made long ago, and that we kind of just buy into, that tells us, that this is the person who's going to decide life, liberty, and death, whether they're going to go away, to prison for life. And so you'll have to try to maybe reread that reading with this understanding. And then what judges do is they signal to everyone in the system who's compliant with it. So that's us, right? That's corrections officers, that's police officers, that's guards, right? That's business owners, everybody who's in this participation. We're all waiting for the judge to signal to us, is this person alive or dead? So it's a lot like in those ancient Roman Colosseum films, right? Where you're watching the gladiators fight and the guy puts the thumb up or down, right? That's what we're all kind of doing here. So again, this is a social system that we've created, and we've given this role, we've given this job to the judge to decide between life and death. But we're all complicit in it, unless, of course, we're resisting it, right? If you're resisting it, like the founders did, then you're not complicit, right? And so you're not really accepting that signal or using the signal for a different purpose. So if you started to understand that, then you'd understand that judges are not neutral. In fact, they couldn't be neutral, right? The whole design of their job is to not be neutral. But what they are is complicit with the organized state violence, is that the state says we get a monopoly of violence, meaning the police, right, the administrators, and the judges are saying we get to use violence, you don't get to use violence. And so they're the ones who are organizing that. So quiz 3 then builds on this understanding. Once you understand the systemic idea of the legal system, now you're going to see how interpretation works within the politics and the doctrines that exist. So judges don't do whatever they want. They're not just sitting there making things up, right? They're educated, they're trained, and they're following very specific legal doctrines that have been handed down and worked out for hundreds of years by other judges. And so they're kind of operating within almost like a manual. It's not a manual. It doesn't tell them exactly what to do, but it works almost like one, right? It's if I have a question, I go to my various legal books and I start looking for how have judges made these decisions in the past. That's going to inform me. It doesn't tell me exactly what to do, but it gives me some ideas on what judges have done before in similar situations. It doesn't tell me what to do because the situation is not going to be exactly the same, right? Segregation is going to be different in our society than it was in the 1950s or in the 1890s because our societies are different, right? And so judges are never going to have a playbook that says, okay, I'm looking up, 13B. Okay, this is the right answer. I'm going to do it. That's not how this is ever going to work. That's because every single bill that goes through Congress or goes through the state legislature or goes through the New York Council, right? Every law that's passed needs interpretation. It's because it was a product of a lot of different people working together. They might have meant different things. They might have compromised. They might have not written it very well, right? There's lots of different parts of this process that are then going to require judges to actually find out what on earth is this supposed to mean. So of course interpretation is also influenced by your politics. If you're a Republican, you're going to read like a Republican. If you're a Democrat, you're going to read like a Democrat. If you're a socialist, you're going to read like a socialist. If you don't go on and on and on. If you think businesses are great, then you're going to interpret the law to favor businesses. If you think a certain group of people are always going to be criminals, then you're going to interpret the law to conform with that view. And so again, we're not saying bias is bad. Good or bad, it doesn't really matter because there's no such way of not being biased. You're going to be biased. But the level of your bias is going to depend on how much you're aware of it, right? So you can try to limit your bias. But also how much is the system favoring your bias? If the whole system is racist, then there's going to be a racist bias. If the whole system is sexist, then there's going to be a bias against women. You see kind of how this works. It's not about individual motives of one judge, it's about this whole structure. If the doctrines are biased, right? If the doctrines, like in Dr. Chapman's article, is telling you that they're biased for police, right? Against citizens on the street, then the judges are going to follow through with that as well, right? So this is how kind of you need to start thinking this as a system all working together with a bias. Bias just means that it's the mobilization of certain beliefs that dominate over other people's beliefs, right? So it's not good or bad. It can be good or bad depending on how you want to think about it morally, but that's not really the point, right? The point is that there's going to be a bias because people mobilize their beliefs against other people. Your job is to recognize how is it biased, not why is it biased. The other thing to think about is that, so this means judges aren't like your parents. They're not solving a conflict between two people two children who are fighting over a toy, and they're going to make the right answer. This isn't what judges do, right? They answer the questions that have been presented to them by the lawyers, and there's two lawyers arguing against each other. They represent different interests, they represent different ideas, they represent different cultures, right? And so judges are just taking pieces of that, looking to previous doctrines, and based on their education and their training, they're going to make the decision based on that. They're not resolving a conflict. That's not what judges do. So to keep attacking myths here, what you were supposed to see here is, if you believed that law was automatic and it was just something judges did, then there would be no reason for 9 different circuits, right? Everybody, you just need one judge, and one judge would, in fact, you wouldn't even need a person, right? You just need a computer. Just put the question in the computer gives you the answer, right? But that's not how this works. As you see, because of politics, because of these judicial doctrines, there are different ways of interpreting laws in these different regions because the people are different in those regions. If you ever leave New York and you go to Florida, you're going to see the people behave differently. If you ever go to North Dakota, you're going to say they have very different beliefs than we do here in New York. If you go to the West Coast, they behave and have different beliefs. So you see, this is what's going to change. This is what we mean by the common law. It's common to those groups of people. This is the way they behave. This is what they believe. These are the values that they have. And we know that because they pass different laws, as you're kind of seeing with abortion. Different states have different laws, and so their judges are going to interpret it based on what they believe that the people want and what the politics are in that area. And so the law is going to be inconsistent. It's going to contradict itself across the country. It's not going to be evenly applied. And so if there's more bias in Alabama against people of color than there is, say, in New York City, then of course you're going to see more bias in the laws, and you're going to see more bias in the judicial interpretations. So you see this in, one district here, the 6th Court, interprets the law to be more favorable to people without money or insurance, right? They're favoring those people by saying the hospital has an obligation to keep them. Whereas the 9th Circuit, they're kind of seeing this as a game. They're seeing it much more as with the law. They're saying, well, if you're claiming that the hospital kicked you out because you didn't have any money, you're going to have to provide evidence that that's what they were doing. You're going to have to show that that's what they really intended to do. And so you see two very different ways of interpreting the same law. And it's a congressional law, right? So it's supposed to apply evenly across the country, but it doesn't do that in real life. So there you're seeing the gap between ideal and real. So you see this again in student comments, right, in the annotations. So I tend to agree with you, right? Everyone should get treated, even if it's not an emergency, and even if it's, if they don't have money or health care. So that's called universal health care. And there are systems, Sweden, to some extent, the English, right? There are countries that have these kind of systems. The United States doesn't, right? The United States has a private, mostly a private healthcare system where you get healthcare based on what you're able to afford. And then there's a limited public healthcare system where they'll treat limited things and in limited ways. And so there's a very unequal, right? That's a very unequal healthcare system. And so that's what you're seeing in the court decisions. They're reflecting the unequalness and the bias in society. Now going further into this is that you'll see that, going back to in Dr. Chapman's article, it's not that the judges are sitting around, purposefully trying to be favorable towards the police officers. They don't see it that way. What they're doing is they're following 3 doctrines that other judges have participated in. So the courts have been giving qualified immunity to police officers. They've been denying claims of abuse through summary judgment, and they don't apply this superior liability to the larger entity. So this is a combination of encouraging police officers to use excessive force because there's no punishment for them or for the city or for the police department when they do. And so this is an issue of, this is the training of judges, this is the doctrines of judges, this is the education of judges. And so if you're a judge, you'd have to really articulate, you'd have to come up with your own doctrine or a doctrine that would go up against this. And so you can see the pressure there and how difficult that might be. It's not impossible, but you're asking a whole lot of just an individual judge to resist this system. Also in the Chapman reading, you'll see basically a lot of you got this question wrong, which is interesting. I think it's because you wanted the answer to be based on probable cause, or maybe it's because you thought that was a familiar phrase. But one of the reasons why summary judgment is dismissing people's claims of abuse, even though the police, you and I would look at the video and say, well, that was excessive force. The courts are saying you have to prove that it was excessive force, meaning you have to prove that it was excessive force according to the training and the standards of that particular police department. So was it more excessive than what other police officers would have used in that particular case? So again, the courts tend to look at the subjective point of view of the police officers. So it's not really based on what you believe, it's based on what the police training is. So it'd have to be up and above and beyond what they're being told to do, and it would have to be up and beyond that particular situation. So, if somebody has a gun, then, excessive force is going to be less likely to be proved. If someone maybe is, unarmed and they're being pulled out of a car and they're, a chokehold is being applied, okay, then maybe, you'll see an excessive force claim get past summary judgment. But again, you'd have to have evidence, you'd have to have a recording that that's what happened. And so you can see, right, the legal system, if you are a person of color who's being targeted and you go through the legal system thinking you're going to get justice, you're going to develop a up against the law legal narrative, right? You're going to say, wow, this system really isn't for me. It's not working for me. It's working for police officers. Okay, the other issue then comes to the defense that police use, and this is coming from a legal case, right? So again, this isn't coming from a law that was passed in Congress. It's not just the judge making it up. It's that the court came up with this. They took a defense that exists for administrators, for people in Congress, for diplomats, and they're applying it to police officers. This is because the lawyers, on behalf of the police officers, were making this argument to the court. And so the court was persuaded. They thought it was a good legal argument, and so they applied it to this case, and this is now the standard. And so the standard is you have to show that the police officers, again, in addition to using excessive force, was based on their incompetence, that they didn't understand the training, that they didn't understand the protocols, right? So again, very difficult burden for people trying to prove their case of police excessive use of force or wrongful death. Now, this brings us to why do Americans believe judges are neutral? Again, it's because they're told they are, right? It's not them analyzing all these facts. It's not them reading these legal cases. It's not them interviewing people of color who have been, abused by police officers. It's just they're told on a TV show, or they're told in their school or at their church, right? They're told that judges are neutral, and so they believe it. And sadly, even in this class, there's two answers here that, again, are based in myths, right? So the idea that judges are neutral comes up in a student answer. Another idea comes up that the separation of powers, even though there's about 1 million scholarly articles that show there's no such thing as a separation of powers. But you were taught that in school. You were taught to give that answer as being the correct answer, even though it's wrong, even though it's not even remotely close to being right, and it's impossible, in a real life situation. And so you see another student saying, there's supposed to be a balance, but obviously there isn't. That's correct. That's the correct answer. But you also see over here that perhaps students tend to believe in the myths because they don't have any experience of it being untrue, right? They believe in separation of powers because they've never seen it not happen, right? They haven't seen it happen, but they've never seen it not happen, right? So they're going to keep believing in a myth until they get evidence to the contrary. Now, you'd hope that if they did a reading or they were in a class that they'd start to change their mind. But, you can't force people to stop believing in a myth, right? They can believe in any kind of myth, the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, right? You can't force people to stop believing in those things. This then brings us to racism, right? So, somebody might be able to see bias in the judicial system because they've experienced bias in the judicial system, or because they've experienced bias in policing. And so they're probably going to be able to articulate clearly how racism and how inequality affects people differently in the legal system. So something to think about. So these readings that you've been given are trying to help you get to these ideas and help you kind of tackle some of these myths that you might have believed in the past. So in Courts Encourage It, you're learning about 3 legal doctrines that judges follow, and all judges follows this. If you don't, you're going to get overruled, right? That whole hierarchy, right? The judges above you are going to overrule you. So, this is a fact, right? A social fact. There are 3 doctrines that judges follow, and so, right, to try to change police misconduct through the legal system, is very unrealistic, right? You're going to have to try to go about it a different way. In FIRE this time, it's really talking about the word, the articulation of African Americans' experience in the civil rights movement. It's also kind of talking about women and the women's vote, the women's mobilization to get the vote. And so you're seeing experience of resistance, right, as a form of legal resistance. It's not illegal to resist domination. And so you have to see this as anytime the government abuses its power, and government here means politicians when they pass a law, police officers when they use excessive force, judges when they violate your constitutional rights, right? All these situations, it's lawful to resist them, right? That is not an illegal act. That's not what we mean up against the law. This is a situation that has been created by this. And so you've got an explanation of why people do this and how they do it. Then I gave you an article about CSI, crime investigation scenes, and real life, and you see that it's not anything like TV. But the point of this article is that people wish it was. That's an important finding. Like, don't we wish we lived in a world where investigation was just like TV and they could solve the case within 30 minutes? Wouldn't that be lovely, right? But that's not reality. You know, anything you saw on TV, right? Think about this. I mean, it costs like $1 million to make that TV show. You don't have $1 million budgets in most police departments in the country to pay just for crime scene investigation. And so there's more money in Hollywood than there is in most police departments for particular crime scene investigation tools. The other thing here is you learn about violence in the word. I've talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to talk about too much, but just understand that judges engaged in organized violence, what we call the monopoly of violence. You learned about hearsay, but you learned that hearsay is a legal rule. There's a formal definition to it, but it doesn't, you know, it was a white man, Johnny Depp, was able to kind of play games with it and be fun. That's not really what you should do when you're in a court of law, by the way. Don't behave like Johnny Depp. But he could do it because he's a white man with privilege, right? He's a wealthy, well-known celebrity. So he could just kind of play games in the court, and nobody really pushed up against him. In fact, a lot of people heroized him and, you know, worshipped him on social media. Whereas very relevant testimony that was not hearsay, was very important to the case of Trayvon Martin, was not taken seriously because they didn't like the way she spoke, because they didn't like the language she used, because they didn't like her body language. None of those things should matter in a court of law. You should be able to talk how you normally talk in a court of law. Nobody should be changing or not taking your testimony seriously based on how you speak, right? It's not a requirement. There's nothing in a legal system that requires you to change how you talk in order to get justice. But that's the reality, right? Some people are not taken seriously. And because of a racist, sexist structure, women of color in particular aren't taken seriously. Then you learned in Limits of Law that judges are not neutral, and you learned how this works in a real practical example. Now we're starting to look at the segregation. So you read the segregation article and you find that schools are more segregated. And segregated does not mean that they're diverse, right? Segregated means that wealthy white kids have better schools and a better education than other students. And so there should be a representative number of white, upper class, and wealthy students in a public school if it were to be integrated. So again, we're not talking about good or bad, we're talking about facts. This is the reality of the situation. So Brown versus Board of Education, a legal doctrine, is being violated throughout the country. Now the bigger thing that you're going to start to think about in this class is, so now what do we do about it? Do we use the courts? Do we try to pass laws in the legislature? Should there be an organized protest, right? How should this be solved? And then you saw this also in the example of immigration and how people's ideas about the system, the legal system, change based on their cultural values, where they're from, and how they experience the system. And so you'll find that in the reading as well. Next, we had the legality narrative. So I want to just be clear here. Up against the law does not mean breaking the law. A lot of you are kind of making that mistake. It means that the court system is not providing a remedy or justice due to bias. So if you look over here on the right-hand side, normativity, that's the purpose of the system, the legal system. And so people see this, that it's not about justice, it's about whoever has the most power. They're the ones who are going to get justice. They see it as a place where you can kind of go if you want to get some attention, but it's going to be dictated on its own terms, right? The court is going to behave the way that the court behaves, and you can kind of use that to show that you don't get justice. That's really what happened in the Hate U Give. To them, it's people who express the up against the law narrative. It's these social structures, the rules. They're all out to get you. They're not really helping you. They're not there because they're logical. They're there because they're to trick you. This is based in history and experience, right? So this is something that people start to form because this is how they are actually dealing with it in real life. And then the way that they kind of respond to it is you just got to make do. You can't expect anything to change. So this is how people, when they're up against the law, are thinking about the legal system. So again, it doesn't mean breaking the law. So just because you don't follow the law, that doesn't automatically make you up against the law. It's a law that's arbitrary and that's coming after you, and you feel like you're not getting justice. With the law are the games that the rich and lawyers play because they have experience within the legal system. So the more experience you have, the more times you go to court, the more times you use lawyers, the better at the game you're going to get. You're going to learn it better, and you're going to use it to benefit your self-interest. And so it's all about using your experience and your resources to get what you want. Before the law is what most of you seem to believe in. It's the myth of chaos and order, that without before the law, so even though with the law and against the law exist, so this is contradicting your belief already, just the fact that there are these two other belief systems, that there would be chaos, and that basically everyone should follow the rules of police officers even when they're unjust, and that you should do that because it's morally good. You believe this is because you've been taught that it's neutral, right? That it's organized, it's logical, it's a set of rules, and it's just basically filling out paperwork and you'll get justice. Most of you probably believe this because you haven't actually gone through any part of the legal system. Just a basic experience at the legal system, right? This is the I can't force you to get in trouble with the law, right? With not paying your taxes or not filling out a form correctly, or if we start talking about it more and more and more, right, we could make comparisons that might make it a little bit easier, but you have to come up with these examples, right? They have to be based on your life experience. And a lot of you are saying that you don't have any experience, and I bet that's not quite true, but it doesn't matter what I think. It matters how you're able to explain your experiences. So you'd have to start talking about situations in which you worked with formal paperwork, and it worked for you. You got what you wanted, largely probably because somebody in the bureaucracy helped you. So maybe this is possible at the DMV, I'm thinking, right? You fill out the paperwork wrong, but they fix it for you. I'm trying to think of experience some of you might have. Or you were supposed to get a ticket, you thought, and the judge or somebody in the bureaucracy gave you leniency. They didn't give you a ticket. So then you'd still believe in before the law. This is a rational, impartial system that's there to help you. But the point here is to remember that all three are related, integrated, and they exist at the same time. They're not separate things that appear from time to time. They all exist all the time. In Hate U Give, you learned that experience of systemic racism kind of leads to resistance. And so what you saw were police as enforcers of a racist system. They're not protesting against the racist system. Some of them might believe. I've talked to some police officers who understand that the system is racist, and most of them that I've talked to, they're just not sure what to do. And they didn't realize that when they signed up. And so they're kind of stuck, right? They want to get their paycheck, take care of their families. They want to try to do the right thing. But they're now seeing that the system is the problem, not individual police officers. Others don't care, right? I've met some police officers that like the racist system. They think it's good. They think white supremacy should be maintained, and so they're not interested in trying to change anything. So you're going to see the protests as a result of this unequal power, right? In a biased system, there's always going to be resistance at some point. It might be weak resistance, it might be medium resistance, it might be strong resistance, right? But people aren't going to take abuse forever. The justice system is incapable of providing justice in Hate U Give, right? So that reminds us that that's because that's not what the justice system is about. It's a bureaucratic system focused on closing cases. And so if you're not helping close a case, then it's going to be hard for the system to figure out what to do with you. So this leads to popular injustice, and this can be, as you saw in the books, issues of self-defense, taking, priority of your life in your own hands because you can't trust police. It can exist in looting when people have just had enough and they need to express some anger. But it's also about trying to gain equal influence, and this is all desperate acts, right? So they're protesting, they're organizing, they're putting together media campaigns, whatever they can do to try to get people to understand what they're going through. And then to understand finally what she kind of, her main voice was, she had to raise her voice, she had to voice up, and that requires collective action over time. So then this is contrasted to your everyday experience, and so I pulled some of the things that you shared from the discussion board, but I wanted to kind of highlight, right, your point of view is based on your prior education, your family values and beliefs, your cultural production, your acceptance, compliance with norms around you, or your resistance and engagement with others against those norms, and your current unexamined concepts that are now being challenged, right? So I pulled out a few at the beginning here that just show you that there's several students who have never experienced injustice. And so that means systemically they've been treated well. They've been seen as they've gotten a benefit from the system based on how they look, what their background is, and how they kind of adhere to the social norm. So it's hard for them to think about injustice. Whereas towards the bottom here, you can see some of you have gone through multiple injustices. And some of you know people who've gone through injustice. So your points of view are going to be influenced by those experiences. Now, the ideal situation is that you're each listening to each other. So the person who has never experienced injustice and can't quite wrap their head around it needs to listen to the people who've experienced injustices. And people who've experienced injustice, you need to listen to the people who've never experienced it so you have a better idea of why they believe that the system is fair and neutral. This then compares to legal language, and I just pulled out some of them to show you some of the conflicts here. A threshold concept in this class, and in any legal class, is something called the malleability of law. And this is really, if you want to get an A in this class, you have to demonstrate that you understand this concept. And it's the idea that, again, that there's all these things working together: the jurisdiction, judicial precedent, stare decisis, the rules from previous cases, a preference for keeping the system in check, keeping it stable and predictable, the idea of the rule of law as being something that applies to everyone, and this all stems down to basically three people in any given case, right? You've got the judge who's hearing arguments for a lawyer who's for one side, and then a lawyer who's defending the other side. And so they're making arguments within all these cases, right? Previous cases, they're arguing the precedent is like the situation they're defending. They're arguing this is the right jurisdiction. The other side's saying, no, this is the wrong jurisdiction. One side is saying we need to change the system. We need to change the ruling. The other side is, no, we need to keep it stable and predictable. And so judges are listening to these arguments and trying to go with what they think other judges would go with. And they're going to do that based on previous cases. So then if we go a step bigger, we've got the American criminal justice system, and that's, courts are just one part of this structure, right? So we're trying to talk about courts, but we have to understand this larger structure. We have to understand how it relates to each other. And so that means we have to get away from ideals and textbook definitions, and we have to get, how does this really work through the experience of people who are, the ones excluded or suffering injustice, right? That's how we know how the thing is really going. Then we've got precedent, right, that judges are reviewing previous cases and trying to apply rules to the cases at hand with the knowledge that they could be overturned if they apply the precedent incorrectly. But that also builds on this idea of sovereignty, right? So who's the sovereign? Is the judge the sovereign? Is the case the sovereign? Is the rule of law the sovereign? Are all the collective laws the sovereign? Is there a compact between the people and the government? Is the president the sovereign? Is the Supreme Court the sovereign? Are you the sovereign? Am I the sovereign? Is your God the sovereign? I mean, there's so many different ways of thinking about this. But by raising all those questions, you could see there is no sovereign, right? No one holds absolute authority. It's being competed over. That's what politics is deciding who's going to make the decisions. So then this gives us to the myth of rights. This makes us believe, again, it's kind of a childish notion, that rights are going to be protecting us, and it's going to be automatic when we get to the court. But what you'll want to see is that that's not reality. That's not what happens when we actually study the legal system. And so the myth of rights is really conflicting with reality. And so that's a problem. That's why it's a myth. The myth is giving you information that isn't correct. And that's because of the preference towards property-based citizenship. So some people have more rights than others. And those who have more property and more influence in the system through wealth and through business interests, they have more rights than people who are poor and don't have that access. And so again, you can make your own judgments on whether that's good or bad. Some people think that's good. Some people believe that property is the thing that just, shows that there are good people. And so people without property they think are bad. Other people, they make their moral decisions based on different things, how you make your choices, how you treat people. So that's why we don't spend a lot of time talking about morals, is because it really doesn't matter, right? It only matters if you were to get a majority of the population all to agree on a certain set of morals and say, we want our legal system to be based on that. And that's already happened, right? That was the legal system that was designed in the Constitution in 1787. And so we inherit that one, a lot of you, without ever questioning the ideals, even though they might go against your interests. I say that because, as you see, two of the answers in some of the student annotations are showing the myth of rights, right? So showing that you believe that this myth is true, even though, reading after reading, story after story, conversation after conversation, and logic after logic, I'm showing you that it's not true and it's not possible. It couldn't be true. Rights aren't a thing. They don't pop out of the middle of nowhere and say, I'm here to protect you. And so your ability to use rights is going to be based in society. That's what goes back to the system, right? So if the system is unequal, if the system is unjust, then you're not going to be able to use your rights in the same way. If you've never experienced injustice, this might be hard for you to see, because you're going to have the expectation that the rights are always going to be there for you, that life is always going to be good, that the system is always going to be benefit you. I have bad news, it's not, right? There's going to be a situation in which you're going to find out the hard way, but that's usually something that people have to experience if they're not capable of listening to others and empathizing with them. Now, the other side of this is that, as you understand, you're just learning these, and that some of them will be from other classes, but some of them might be wrong, right? You might have learned about the judicial process in a very idealistic textbook definition kind of way, maybe in a class where the person doesn't really know much about the judicial process, right? Their expertise is in something else, and so they just gave you a textbook definition. Remember, then there's thousands of textbooks, right? So they could be different definitions that don't really have anything based in legal scholarship, right? And so that's where we kind of go, now you got to try to think like a critical scholar if you want to get an A in this class, right? And so this is from the handout in your Blackboard, so study guide. This is to help you start now making sense of where you started, right? So in the 1 and 2 area, or the D and C area, and moving towards the 3 and 4, the B and A area, where you're starting to make steps towards understanding how to think like a lawyer, and then how to think like a scholar who's analyzing lawyers and judges within the criminal justice system, and seeing the relationship to the legal system so that you're able to see this kind of big picture. It's a lot, right? And this class is a difficult class. It's a challenging class. It would be just as challenging if you're taking it at John Jay, where it's also offered. And these are advanced classes because you're in the criminal justice program. And so these are the things you're supposed to understand if you want to have a successful career in criminal justice, or if you want to be a scholar within criminal justice. And so that's why we're offering these courses to you, that you can take them here at Kingsborough. Okay, so these are things you're going to review, and I've written it kind of in a narrative so you can kind of say them out loud. Some of the good suggestions the students have had is you write this down, maybe you start practicing using it in some of your answers, and then you've got answers from the quizzes over here on the right that correspond. They go to showing you that, okay, if you understand these answers, then you're starting to think like a critical scholar. So your next steps, right, is you want to think about where you've been. Okay, you think about over the last 7 to 8 weeks, have you been in the D area and maybe you're working it out? And then think about how can you start pushing forward and start to really start using these skills, start practicing in class, and really start trying to use me as a resource, right? I can help you move. You're all going to be in different places. You're all going to be understanding things differently. So don't be afraid to ask me about things that you're struggling with. But now I'm going to also put you into groups so you can start talking to each other, and you're going to start using your presentations from the Flunking Democracy book, which is really focused on a practical, relevant issue to your life that affects you, and gets you to start thinking, okay, if I had to think like a lawyer, what would I do here? So that's going to be the getting there B area. And then at some point you're going to start to hear other students sharing their presentations, and that's where you want to use the critical scholar side and start having discussions about this. This is ultimately going to turn into a legal memo that you're going to do in your groups. And it's going to include all your group member names, and you're going to have to decide, who's going to do what. And this is going to address you're going to start practicing and putting it into motion. So you might think about doing the things together, right? The presentation, legal memo, start working them together. We can raise questions in class, we can talk about it. But this will hopefully get you finally to the, at least getting there, if not to the you got it phase. And everybody has a chance to get there, and we can all try to get there together. So that's the last 8 weeks. I know it's a lot, but now I've tried to really focus on just the big picture stuff so you see how everything kind of connects.